There is a night that does not belong to the calendar. It exists in the breath between exhale and inhale, in the pause between heartbeats, in the hour when October dies and November is not yet born. The Celts called it Samhain, though even that word is a whisper of something older, something that predates language itself. Saw-in, sav-en, the phonetics shift depending on who speaks it, but the meaning remains constant: the ending of summer, the death of light, the threshold. On this night, the world unhooks itself from ordinary time. The boundary between what is seen and what is hidden grows thin as frost on glass. The living and the dead draw close enough to touch. And the darkness, ancient, patient, indifferent, waits at every threshold, at every crackling fire that dares to hold it back. Somewhere in the west of Ireland, on a hillside older than memory, a cave mouth opens into the earth. The locals know not to go near it after sunset on this particular evening. They know what emerges when the veil is thin. They have always known. This is not a story about Halloween. This is the story beneath Halloween. The blood and bone and burning peat from which all our modern rituals were born. This is the story of a people who understood that darkness is not the enemy of light, but its inevitable companion. That death is not the opposite of life, but its deepest truth. And that once a year, for a single turning of the earth, all the rules suspend. Welcome to Samhain. Welcome to the night between worlds. To understand Samhain, you must first understand how the ancient Celts measured time. Not in straight lines, not in numbered days, marching from January to December. Time moved in spirals and cycles, in the great wheel of the year that turned and always returned to the same sacred points. The Celts perceived the world as fundamentally dual, not in opposition but in balance. Light and dark, growth and decay, the visible and the invisible. And they understood that these pairs were not separate realms, but interwoven states, each containing the seed of the other. This is why their day began at sunset, not sunrise. Darkness came first. From darkness, light was born. The year divided into two great halves. Beltane, the 1st of May, marked summer's beginning. Cattle driven to high pastures. Crops pushing toward the sun. The world exhaling warmth and abundance. Fires lit on hilltops to honor the returning light, to protect the herds, to celebrate fertility and growth. And then came Samhain, the 1st of November, Winter's Gate. But to call it simply Winter's Start misses everything. Samhain was a rupture in the fabric of reality itself, a moment when the boundaries that held the world in place came undone. The Celts understood that time was not merely the sun's path across the sky, but the interplay of light and darkness, life and death, the visible world and the one dwelling beneath. At Samhain, these opposites met. They merged. They bled into one another like watercolors on wet parchment. The turning point, the hinge, the crack in the door. The Celts recognized certain places as inherently liminal, locations where the boundary between this world and the other was always thinner. Springs, where water emerged from the earth's depths. Crossroads where paths intersected. Islands that appeared and disappeared with the tide. caves that descended into darkness, and burial mounds. Always the burial mounds. In County Roscommon, Ireland, there stands a place that even now carries the weight of this ancient threshold. Rathcrogan, Rathcruachan, a complex of earthworks and burial mounds that once served as the ceremonial center of Connaught, the seat of kings, the location of assemblies, and sacred gatherings. Within Rathcrogan lies something stranger still, a cave, a mouth in the earth, a passage descending into darkness. Owainagat, the Cave of the Cats. That name, soft and domestic, disguises what it truly is. Waim Nagikat, the entrance to the other world, where the membrane between here and there grows so thin it can be crossed. On Samhain night, the stories say, creatures emerge, not symbols, not metaphors. The medieval texts describe them with unsettling specificity. Three-headed birds that breathe poison and blight the land. Pigs with red hides that cannot be killed by any weapon. A woman named Morrígan, the phantom queen, who walks out of the cave, speaking prophecies of war and ruin, her voice echoing with the screams of crows. And behind them all, the Aos Sí, the ancient ones, the people of the mounds, the race that dwelt in Ireland before humans and never truly left. To encounter them was to risk everything, but it was also an opportunity for knowledge, for vision, for communion with forces that shaped the world before time had a name. Sacred power is never safe. But why this moment? Why did the veil thin precisely at October's end? The answer lies in blood and soil. By late October, the fields were bare. Grain stored in pits and granaries. Livestock brought down from summer pastures, their breath misting in the cooling air. The weakest animals slaughtered, not enough fodder to sustain them through the lean months, blood soaked into the earth. Smoke rose from butchering fires, not cruelty, survival. The bargain that sustained human existence. The harvest was complete. The work of summer was finished. And now came the long waiting, the months when nothing grew, when the earth slept beneath frost and snow, when survival depended on what had been stored, what had been preserved, what could be rationed through the dark. This was a time of profound uncertainty. Would the stores last? Would the livestock survive? Would winter be mild or harsh? In that moment, between harvest's abundance and winter's scarcity, something opened. A door swinging on unseen hinges, a breath held too long, finally released. Samhain was the death of the year. And like all deaths, both ending and transformation, the old year died on October 31st. The new year was born on November 1st. And in the hours between, in that liminal darkness, anything was possible. The dead walked, the gods descended. Time itself came unmoored, preparations began. Fires were lit, prayers spoken, offerings set out for those who would come knocking. Because on Samhain night, you did not lock your door against the darkness. You invited it in. There is a world that exists alongside ours, separated by nothing more than a shift in perception. The Celts called it the Otherworld, Tir na Nog, the land of the young, or Mag Mell, the pleasant plain. But these poetic names disguise something far more ambiguous than paradise. The Otherworld was not heaven, not hell. simply other. A realm where time moved differently, where a single night might span years, where beauty and terror wore the same face, where apples grew that granted immortality, but eating them meant you could never return home, where music played so beautiful it could kill you with longing. Imagine it, a land where the grass is always green, where no one ages, where the mead never runs dry and the meat is never consumed, where the halls are lit by no fire, yet glow with perpetual twilight, where the most beautiful beings you have ever seen offer you gifts, and you must decide in an instant, with no time for reflection, whether accepting means surrendering something you cannot name but will desperately miss. The gods dwelt there. The dead continued their existence there, and the old races, the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, retreated there after the arrival of mortal humans. The Lebor Gabala Erin, the Book of Invasions, tells this story as mythic pseudo-history, a medieval attempt to reconcile Irish legend with biblical chronology. Written by Christian monks seeking to fit pagan mythology into a Christian framework, it claims the Tuatha De Danann, after defeat by the mortal Milesians, divided Ireland in two. The Milesians would rule the surface world, but the Tuatha De Danann would rule below, the hollow hills, the other world in perpetual twilight. Not exile, coexistence. Two worlds pressed against each other like drumhead skins, most of the time, the boundary held, each realm invisible to the other. But the boundary was not impermeable. It could be crossed at certain times, in certain places by certain people. Sunset and sunrise were liminal times. Dusk and dawn, when the world was neither day nor night. Crossroads were liminal places. Shores where land met water, marshlands where solid and liquid merged. But at Samhain, the barrier dissolved. The worlds interpenetrated. Beings could cross in both directions, spirits entering the mortal realm. And mortals, if they were brave or foolish enough, stepping into the otherworld. The Aos Sí, the people of the mounds, later anglicized as Sidhe, became the primary inhabitants of this hidden realm. When Christianity arrived and could not suppress belief in them, they were rationalized as fairies, a term since drained of its weight and danger. But the sea were never delicate winged creatures. They were tall, beautiful, terrible. They could bestow great gifts, musical talent, poetic inspiration, healing knowledge, or terrible curses. They could steal children and leave changelings in their place. They were, in many ways, reflections of nature itself, neither good nor evil, but operating according to their own laws. Like a storm, like the ocean, powerful, beautiful, and without mercy for those who failed to show proper respect. They lived in the ancient burial mounds, the Cid, that dotted the landscape like bones pushing through skin. Each mound a doorway, a threshold, a place where one might slip between worlds. And on Samhain, these doors stood open. No secret words needed, no complex rituals required, just proximity. Just the wrong step at the wrong moment. The medieval Irish tales are filled with stories of what happened on Samhain night. Warriors who ventured too close to a fairy mound and found themselves pulled inside, feasting with beautiful strangers, only to emerge what felt like hours later to discover years, sometimes centuries, had passed. Their families aged or dead, their homes in ruins. Women who heard music drifting from beneath a hill and followed it into passages that led deeper into the earth, into halls lit by no fire, where time stood still, and the wine never emptied, and the most beautiful beings they had ever seen offered them everything: knowledge, pleasure, immortality, at a price never clearly stated but always, eventually, paid. These were not children's stories. These were warnings. The dead returned as well, not as ethereal spirits, but as something more substantial. The ancient Celts did not conceive of death as one-way departure. The dead remained part of the community, dwelling in the other world, but maintaining connections to the living. Ancestors, guardians, sources of wisdom and warning, but also hungry, also yearning, also sometimes angry at being forgotten. On Samhain night, the dead would return to places they had known in life, former homes, ancestral lands, hearths where they had once warmed themselves. And the living had a responsibility to welcome them, to set a place at the table, to leave the door unbarred, not sentimentality, obligation. To honor the dead was to maintain the bond between living and those gone before. To ignore them was to risk their anger, or worse, their forgetting. To be forgotten is the second death, the final one, the erasure from which there is no return. As long as someone speaks your name, lights a candle for you, tells stories about you, you persist. But when the last person who remembers you dies, when your name is no longer spoken, when your stories are no longer told, then you are truly gone. Families prepared as darkness fell. A meal set out, but no one eating from it. A chair left empty, the fire built high, the door unlocked. And when wind rose and rattled the shutters, when flames guttered and shadows moved at the edge of vision, the living remained very still. The dead were home. But the dead were not always gentle. The slúg, the host of the dead, were said to fly through the night sky on Samhain, hunting for souls to carry back with them. They moved like a storm, like a murder of crows descending on homes, of those who had wronged them, or those whose time had come. They were composed of the unquiet dead, those who had died violent deaths, or in sin, or with unfinished business, binding them to the mortal world. To hear the slúg was an omen of death. To see them was to be marked. People stayed indoors after dark, kept fires burning, spoke in low voices. And if they had to venture outside to check on livestock, to fetch water from the well, they wore clothing inside out to confuse spirits, carried iron to repel the sea, whispered prayers to gods whose names had not yet been buried beneath Christian saints. Protection was essential. The beings that crossed from the otherworld were not inherently malevolent, but they were not human. They did not share human values or human mercy. They operated according to rules that were older, stranger, far less forgiving. But the danger was not the only reason for fear. There was also the knowledge that the year had died, that winter was coming, that the months ahead would be dark and uncertain, that some celebrating Samhain this year would not live to see it again. The veil between life and death was thin. but so was the veil between survival and starvation, warmth and freezing. Perhaps the veil we sense thinning is not between worlds at all, but within the mind, between what we remember and what we refuse to see. Between the face we show by daylight and the shadow self that walks through our dreams, unacknowledged but ever present. Between our conscious intentions and the deeper drives that move us in ways we don't understand. Samhain forced confrontation with what the rest of the year allowed to be forgotten. That life is fragile, that death is certain, and that the darkness eventually claims everything. But in that confrontation, there was also power. To face the darkness is to rob it of surprise. To name the dead is to keep them close. To light a fire against the night is to declare that you still exist. And so the rituals began. Fire has always been humanity's first defense against the dark, warmth, light, protection. But on Samhain, fire became something more than necessity. It became liminal substance, a bridge between worlds, a way of marking sacred space in a night when all boundaries were unstable. The Celts built bonfires, massive communal blazes visible for miles. These were need fires, flames kindled through ritual and intention, meant to carry the power of renewal and ward off malevolent forces. In some regions, all hearth fires would be extinguished at sunset on Samhain. Every home, every cooking fire snuffed out. Darkness allowed to enter. The old flame had to die before the new could be born. Then, in the center of the community, hilltop, sacred clearing, crossroads, the druids or elders would kindle new flame. Methods varied. Friction fires, created by spinning wooden drill against plank until heat gave birth to ember. Flint and iron, spark and tinder. Marriage of stone and metal producing light. What mattered was that the fire was new, born in the threshold moment, carrying the energy of transition. Once the bonfire roared to life, the entire community gathered. Imagine it, the darkness absolute, punctured only by this single source of light. Faces emerging from shadow, then retreating. The smell of peat smoke curling into the October sky, mixing with wet wool and cold earth. The heat of the flames on your face, while your back remains cold, wind cutting through your cloak. The sound of cattle lowing in the darkness, restless, sensing something in the air. Cattle were driven between two fires. A ritual purification meant to protect the herd through winter. The animals balked and bellowed, eyes rolling white in the firelight, but they were urged through the narrow passage. The smoke and heat were believed to ward off disease, to drive away spirits that might harm the livestock. Bones were thrown into the flames. Some say bonfire, once meant bone fire, recalling the offerings cast into the blaze, gifts to the dead, to the gods, to forces governing fertility and survival. The bones of slaughtered animals returned to the element that could transform them from matter into essence, from flesh into spirit. Dancing began, drinking, singing, storytelling that lasted late into the night. Tales of heroes who had walked into fairy mounds and returned changed, of gods who had battled for the fate of Ireland, of the Morrígan who appeared at fords and battlefields to prophesy doom or victory. But beneath celebration, always caution. The fire was a beacon, but it also attracted attention. Light drew eyes from the darkness, not all of them human. The people remained vigilant, watching the edges of firelight for movement, for shapes that didn't quite resolve. When night grew late and embers began to fade, each family carried a burning brand from the communal fire back to their own hearth. The fire they carried home was imbued with communal power, with blessings of the seasons turning, with protection. To let that flame die before reaching the threshold was to invite misfortune. But fire was not the only tool. Guising, wearing disguises, predates modern trick-or-treating by over 1,000 years. On Samhain, people dressed in animal skins, wore masks carved from wood, blackened their faces with ash. They became something other than themselves, not costume, camouflage. If the dead and the sea were walking abroad, the living needed to avoid being recognized. By disguising themselves, people could move through the dangerous night without drawing attention. They could blend into the liminal crowd, becoming neither fully alive nor fully dead, neither fully human nor fully other. Children especially would dress up and go from house to house, singing songs, reciting poetry, or performing small rituals in exchange for food. Entertainment, yes, but also protective circuit, a way of knitting the community together. And crucially, it ensured that no home was left dark and unvisited. Because isolation on Samhain was dangerous, inside the home, other rituals unfolded. The dumb supper persisted for centuries in Celtic regions. A meal prepared and set out, sometimes simple bread and butter, sometimes full feast, but no one speaking during its preparation or placement. Silence maintained out of respect for the dead, who were believed to gather invisibly around the table. An empty chair at the head of the table, a place setting arranged with care. The family eating their own meal in reverent quiet, aware they were not alone. That the grandfather who had died last winter might be sitting in that empty chair, unseen but present. After the meal, divination rituals began. Samhain was the most potent night for seeing into the future. The same thinning that allowed the dead to return also made it possible to glimpse what was coming. Marriage, death, fortune, ruin. Many of these practices, apple peeling, nut divination, mirror gazing, developed in late medieval and early modern periods, but the impulse was ancient, to use the liminal moment to peer beyond the veil. Young women would peel an apple in one long strip and throw the peel over their shoulder, reading their beloved's initial in the shape it made. Apples, sacred fruit, associated with the Otherworld, said to grow on the Isle of Avalon, were used in dozens of divination games. Apples floating in basins of water, caught with teeth. Success meant marriage within the year. Nuts cast into the fire, each representing a suitor or question. If the nut burned quietly, the omen was good. If it popped or jumped, trouble was coming. Hazelnuts especially were considered potent. Trees of wisdom in Celtic tradition, growing beside sacred wells where the salmon of knowledge swam, mirrors used as portals. At midnight on Samhain, if you sat before a mirror in a darkened room and brushed your hair, you might see a face appear behind your reflection, your future spouse, or if death was near, something else entirely. Not parlor games, serious inquiries into the shape of fate, but not all divination was romantic or hopeful. Some rituals sought direct communication with the dead. Offerings left at crossroads or at the edges of burial mounds, milk, bread, the first portion of a meal. Prayers spoken into darkness, questions asked of those who had crossed over. And sometimes, rarely, only by those with training or desperate courage, a person might attempt to cross the threshold themselves, to walk into the other world and return with knowledge. These journeys were perilous. The other world did not release visitors easily. Time moved differently there. You might spend what felt like a single night dancing and feasting, only to return and discover decades had passed. Your family aged or dead, your home in ruins. Or you might feast with the sea, only to find that the food bound you to them, that a single bite meant you could never eat mortal food again, never fully return to the human world, forever caught between realms. The other world was seductive, beautiful, timeless. Music that made mortal songs sound like the scraping of crows. Beauty that made mortal lovers seem plain. Wine that never left you thirsty, but left you unable to taste water without longing, but also a trap. Most people contented themselves with more modest contact. The flicker of a candle in a windless room, the rattle of wind that sounds almost like words, the sense of presence just beyond sight. To know the dead are near is one thing. To follow them is quite another. As night wore on and rituals concluded, families would bank their fires, bar their doors, settle into uneasy sleep, knowing that until the sun rose and November truly began, they were living in a world that belonged as much to the dead as to the living. And when dawn finally broke, pale and cold across the landscape, there would be a collective exhalation, a release of breath held through long, dark hours. Samhain was over. The veil had thickened once more. The dead had returned to their resting places, the sea to their hollow hills, for another year at least. But nothing survives unchanged. When Christianity arrived in Celtic lands, slowly at first, through missionaries and monks who walked alone into pagan territories, then more forcefully through political conversion, the old festivals faced a choice: disappear or adapt. Samhain chose adaptation. The church understood something important. You cannot simply erase a holy day, woven into the fabric of a people's understanding of time, death, and the cosmos. Prohibition creates resentment. Suppression drives practices underground. But transformation, that could work. The strategy was neither accidental nor unique to Celtic lands. Across Europe, the church had learned to overlay Christian meaning onto pagan festivals. The winter solstice became Christmas. The spring equinox became Easter. The midsummer fires became the feast of St. John the Baptist. Not erasure, but rewriting. Not destruction, but redirection. In the 8th century, Pope Gregory III designated November 1st as All Saints' Day, a holy day honoring all Christian saints and martyrs, known and unknown. The feast had originally been celebrated in May, but its relocation to November was deliberate and strategic. Later, in the 10th century, Abbot Odilo of Cluny established November 2nd as All Souls' Day, dedicated to praying for the dead in purgatory. The living could offer prayers, masses, and alms on behalf of the departed, helping to shorten their time in that intermediate state. The timing was not coincidental. By placing these sacred days directly atop Samhain, the Church Christianized the festival without destroying its essential function. The dead were still honored. The boundary between worlds was still acknowledged. The community still gathered. Fires were still lit. Food was still offered. But now, instead of offering food to pagan ancestors or appeasing the sea, people were praying for Christian souls. Instead of leaving doors unbarred for the returning dead, they lit candles in churches. Instead of fearing the sluag, they trusted in the intercession of saints. The night before All Saints' Day became All Hallows' Eve. Hallow, from the Old English hallig, meaning holy, sacred. The eve of all holy ones, the threshold before the sacred. Halloween. The shape of the old festival remained, but its content had shifted, or had it? Perhaps the content had been given new names, new explanations, while the deep structure remained intact. Bonfires continued, now blessed by priests who sprinkled holy water and recited prayers. But the fires still purified, still protected, still marked the boundary between sacred and profane. Costumes persisted, incorporating Christian imagery. Children dressed as saints and angels alongside traditional guises. But the impulse remained the same: to become other, to move through the dangerous night without being recognized. Offerings of food remained, reframed as acts of charity for the poor, who would go door to door souling, asking for soul cakes in exchange for prayers for the dead. This was syncretism at its most elegant, the new faith absorbing old practices, reshaping them, giving them new language while preserving their essential rhythm. But the transformation was never complete. In rural areas, far from centers of church power, the old ways persisted alongside the new. People attended Mass on All Saints' Day, but they also left offerings at the fairy mounds. They prayed for Christian souls, but they also remembered the older dead, the ancestors who still walked at Samhain according to ancient patterns. Two traditions, pagan and Christian, existed side by side, bleeding into each other, creating something hybrid and strange, something that was neither purely pagan nor purely Christian, but uniquely Celtic. In Ireland, the fairy faith remained strong well into the modern era, into the 19th century, even into the 20th. People might call themselves Catholic, attend church regularly, recite the rosary, but they would also avoid disturbing fairy trees, leave cream out for the good folk, never disrespect the old mounds. When roads were built, they were routed around certain trees and stones, even if it meant extra cost, because to disturb them was to invite disaster. When houses were constructed, certain locations were avoided because everyone knew that spot belonged to the sea. Not hypocrisy, pragmatism, wisdom born of living in a landscape that had been sacred long before Christianity arrived. The sea had been here first, and they would be here last. Better to honor both traditions than to anger either. Samhain evolved into something complex, layered, impossible to reduce to simple categories. It became a festival that belonged to the people themselves, shaped by centuries of practice and the stubborn persistence of memory. The church might have claimed November 1st, but the night before, the liminal darkness, the threshold hour, remained wild, remained unclaimed, remained in some essential way unchanged. Because certain truths cannot be baptized, certain rhythms cannot be sanctified into something else. Certain nights belong to the darkness, no matter what prayers you speak. You can light candles against it. You can speak the names of saints. You can trust in redemption and resurrection. But the darkness remains, patient, indifferent, eternal. And once a year, at the turning of October into November, it remembers us as we remember it. In the 19th century, Ireland bled. The Great Famine and Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, tore through the island between 1845 and 1852, killing 1 million people and forcing another million to flee. The potato blight destroyed the staple crop, and British policies of food export and inadequate relief turned natural disaster into catastrophe of genocidal proportion. Those who could left. They crowded into ships bound for America, for Canada, for Australia, anywhere that offered the possibility of survival. The crossing was brutal. Coffin ships, they were called, packed beyond capacity. Disease spreading in the cramped quarters. Bodies buried at sea. Those who survived arrived traumatized, grief-stricken, carrying almost nothing. A few possessions tied in a bundle, a handful of seed, and the memories of a culture that had sustained them for thousands of years. Among those memories was Samhain. The Irish who arrived in America brought their traditions, the bonfires, the guising, the recognition that late October held particular power. They brought their beliefs about the dead, their respect for the otherworld, their practices of divination and protection. But in the New World, those traditions encountered resistance. American Protestant society viewed Irish Catholic customs with suspicion at best, hostility at worst. The Irish were considered foreign, superstitious, dangerously Catholic. They were too poor, too different. Their festivals were dismissed as papist nonsense or pagan holdovers. Newspaper editorials railed against Irish superstitions. Protestant ministers preached against Catholic festivals that encouraged belief in spirits and the supernatural. Samhain went underground. It was celebrated quietly, within immigrant communities, in urban neighborhoods where Irish families clustered, New York's Five Points, Boston's North End, Philadelphia's Kensington. The bonfires became smaller, more contained, rituals simplified, old stories told in whispers. But traditions, like water, find a way through. By the late 1800s, Samhain, now called Halloween, began to merge with American culture. The process was gradual, shaped by commercialization and cultural exchange. Irish traditions mixed with Scottish, English, and German customs, creating something new. Something American in a way that reflected the nation's immigrant character. Hybrid, adaptive, constantly reinventing itself. The jack-o'-lantern is a perfect example of this transformation. In Ireland and Scotland, turnips or beets were hollowed out and carved with faces, then set with candles inside. These were placed in windows or carried through the dark to ward off malevolent spirits. The practice came from an old folk tale about a man named Jack, Stingy Jack or Jack the Smith, who tricked the devil through clever bargains. When Jack died, he was barred from heaven because of his sinful life, but the devil also barred him from hell. Condemned to wander the earth forever, Jack carved out a turnip, placed a coal from hell inside to light his way, and became Jack of the Lantern. Irish immigrants in America discovered that turnips were less common, but pumpkins, native to North America and far larger, were plentiful and easier to carve. The American pumpkin jack-o'-lantern, with its triangular eyes and jagged grin, became visual shorthand for Halloween, a symbol simultaneously Irish in origin, American in execution, and rooted in folk belief about the restless dead. But the transformation went beyond jack-o'-lanterns. By the early 20th century, Halloween was becoming commercialized and sanitized. Companies began producing greeting cards, costumes, decorations. The holiday was repackaged as wholesome family entertainment, stripped of its deeper meanings. The genuine belief in a thinning veil, the respectful fear of the dead, the sense of cosmic transition, these were being discarded in favor of something more palatable, something that could be sold, commodified, made safe. Halloween became a children's holiday, a night for costumes and candy, for parties and pranks. The element of genuine fear was diminished, replaced with theatrical spookiness that carried no real weight. The dead were no longer actually present. They were decorations, cardboard cutouts, cartoon ghosts. The Otherworld was no longer a place you might accidentally stumble into. It was a theme, a mood, an aesthetic choice, and yet beneath the commercialization, something persisted. The timing remained. Late October, when the year begins its descent into darkness. The costumes remained. The impulse to disguise oneself, to become something other. The offerings remained, trick or treating, that exchange between the living and those who come knocking. The structure of the ritual survived, even as its meaning became obscured. Ritual has a way of preserving truth, even when we've forgotten what that truth is. The form continues even when the content is lost, waiting for the moment when someone remembers, when someone asks, "Why do we do this? Where did this come from?" The Irish who brought Samhain to America may have seen their festival diluted and commercialized, but they also ensured its survival. By allowing Halloween to adapt, to become American, they kept it alive. And in recent decades, something unexpected has happened. People have begun to ask those questions, have begun to remember. In Edinburgh, Scotland, on the night of October 31st, the dead city comes alive with fire. The Samhain Fire Festival, held annually atop Calton Hill, is a modern reconstruction of ancient practice, a deliberate attempt to reclaim something nearly lost. Begun in the 1980s by a collective of artists, performers, and neo-pagan practitioners, the festival draws thousands each year to witness the ritual, death, and rebirth of the seasons. Drums thunder in the darkness. Torches blaze against the night sky. Hundreds of them, carried by performers in elaborate costume and body paint. The Summer King and Winter Queen, figures dressed in white and black, embodying the dual nature of existence, enact the turning of the year through dance, procession, and ritual combat. The crowd falls silent as the battle commences. Summer, radiant and golden, fights to maintain dominance. Winter, stark and terrible, presses forward with inexorable force. The outcome is never in doubt. Winter must win, the year must turn. But the ritual enacts the eternal truth that light and dark, life and death, are locked in endless cycle. When winter triumphs, when summer falls, there is no sadness in the crowd, only recognition, only the acknowledgement of what everyone knows but spends most of the year pretending to forget, that all things end, that darkness always returns. This is not historical reenactment, not exact replication of what the ancient Celts did. Those rituals are lost, their details unrecoverable. It is something both older and newer, a living tradition, resurrected and reimagined, a way of connecting with something that speaks to, needs deeper than history, more primal than accuracy. The revival of Samhain as spiritual practice is part of a broader renaissance of Celtic paganism that began in the mid-20th century. Movements like Wicca incorporated Samhain as one of the 8 Sabbats of the Wheel of the Year. Druidry, revived by groups like the Order of Bards, Ovats, and Druids, reclaimed Celtic spiritual practices. Celtic Reconstructionism sought to recover pre-Christian European spirituality through study of historical sources. Critics dismiss these practices as invented traditions, lacking authentic continuity with the ancient past. They point out, correctly, that modern paganism is largely a 20th century creation, drawing on fragmentary sources, romantic idealizations, and creative imagination. The Druids of 2,000 years ago left almost no written records. Much of what we think we know comes from Roman authors like Julius Caesar, who had their own biases, who were outsiders looking in. The sacred groves are gone. The oral traditions are lost. The exact rituals performed at Samhain 2,000 years ago are unrecoverable. But perhaps authenticity is the wrong measure. Perhaps the question should not be, is this what the ancient Celts did? But rather, does this serve the same function? Does it address the same needs? How do we honor the dead? How do we mark the passage of time? How do we confront the darkness without flinching? How do we find meaning in a universe that offers us no cosmic guarantees? The people who gather on Calton Hill, or who celebrate Samhain in private rituals, or who attend ceremonies in forests and fields, they are engaging in what anthropologists call meaningful practice. The creation of personal and communal rituals that provide structure, connection, and transcendence. They light fires because humans have always lit fires against the dark. Because fire is transformation. Because flame bridges the gap between matter and spirit. They honor the dead because the dead are always with us. Because we carry their DNA and their stories. Because we stand on foundations they built. They mark the turning of the year because time is not something that happens to us. It is something we participate in, shape, and give meaning to through our attention. In doing so, they participate in a conversation that stretches back thousands of years, connecting the present moment to something far older than any individual life. The fire on Calton Hill is the same fire that burned on the hills of ancient Ireland. Not literally. The wood is different. The people are different. The world is transformed. But essentially, symbolically, in the realm of meaning, which is the only realm that ultimately matters. Beyond Edinburgh, Samhain has been reclaimed in countless other ways. The Glastonbury Goddess Temple holds a ritual each year where participants write the names of their beloved dead on pieces of paper and burn them in a cauldron. In Ireland, the Puka festival has revived Samhain traditions with processions, storytelling, and fire ceremonies in Meath and Louth. In America, where Halloween had become almost entirely secularized, pagan communities have worked to restore the sacred dimension. Samhain circles gather in forests and parks. Dumb suppers are held. Ancestor altars are constructed. Photographs and mementos arranged with candles and offerings. Even among those who don't identify as pagan, there's a growing recognition that Halloween can be more than candy and costumes. That there's something valuable in pausing to remember those who have died. That the tradition of honoring ancestors has psychological and spiritual value. Samhain survives because it speaks to something that cannot be commercialized out of existence, cannot be sanitized into irrelevance, cannot be forgotten no matter how much time passes. It survives because every autumn, when the air turns cold and the leaves begin to fall, when breath mists in the morning and frost glazes the ground, we feel it. The thinning, the opening, the sense that the world is not quite as solid as we pretend. Listen, can you hear it? The wind through the heather, the lowing of cattle brought down from high pastures, the whisper of iron charms hung at doorways to ward off what prowls in the darkness. Smell it, peat smoke curling into the October sky. Wet wool drying by the fire, the earth exhaling cold, the scent of decay that is also the promise of renewal. Feel it, the chill that has nothing to do with temperature, the awareness, sudden and complete, that you are not alone, that something watches from just beyond the firelight, patient and curious and impossibly old. This is the gift of Samhain, not comfort, but clarity. The recognition that we are small before the vastness of time, fragile before the certainty of death, temporary in a way that is both terrifying and liberating. There is a night that does not belong to the calendar. It exists between the ticks of the clock, in the pause between one breath and the next, in the space where the year dies and is reborn. The ancient Celts built bonfires and told stories and left their doors unlocked for the dead. They knew that darkness is not something to be defeated, but something to be honored, because darkness is half of existence, and to reject it is to reject half of what it means to be alive. They knew that death is not the enemy of life, but its necessary partner. The shadow that gives light its meaning, the silence that makes music possible. They knew that time is not linear, but cyclical, that endings are also beginnings. We have tried to forget this knowledge. We have filled our world with constant light, banishing the darkness to the margins. We have constructed elaborate systems of denial around death, hiding it away in hospitals and funeral homes, treating it as aberration rather than inevitability, as failure rather than completion. We have convinced ourselves that we are separate from nature, exempt from its cycles, able to transcend the limitations that govern all other living things. We have built a civilization on the fantasy of endless growth, refusing to acknowledge that all things cycle, that what grows must also decay, that winter always follows summer. But once a year, on this particular night, the knowledge returns. We feel it in the cold wind that carries the scent of decay, which is also the scent of transformation. We see it in the bare branches reaching towards the sky, already preparing for spring, though winter has not yet begun. We sense it in the darkness, patient and waiting. And if we are brave enough to look, really look without flinching, we might catch a glimpse of what the Celts saw, that the dead are not gone, but transformed, that the otherworld is not elsewhere, but here, layered beneath the surface. That time is not a line, but a spiral, and every ending contains the seed of a new beginning. Who can say where the living end and the dead begin? Who can draw the line between this world and the other, between the face we show by daylight and the shadow that walks beside us unseen? Perhaps the veil we sense thinning is the boundary between what we show and what we bury, the parts of ourselves we present to the world and the depths we fear to acknowledge, the socially acceptable self and the wild self, the civilized self and the animal self. Perhaps Samhain invites us to encounter not only the ancestral dead, but the shadowed territories within our own souls, the grief we haven't processed, the rage we've suppressed, the fear we've denied, the mortality we've refused to face, to sit with what we have lost, to name what we refuse to see, to light a candle in the interior darkness and watch what emerges from the flame. This is the ancient magic, still available. The willingness to face what frightens us and find, in that confrontation, not destruction but transformation, not death but depth. We are not separate from the dead. We are part of a long chain of becoming that stretches back to the origin of life itself. We are the temporary manifestation of a pattern that repeats and varies, that dies and is reborn. Every cell in our body carries DNA inherited from ancestors stretching back billions of years. Every story we tell echoes stories told around fires for hundreds of thousands of years. Every fear we face, they faced. Every joy we experience, they experienced. We are not alone. We have never been alone. Time is not our enemy, but our teacher. It shows us what matters by showing us what doesn't last. It teaches us to love fiercely because we will lose what we love. It teaches us to create beauty because beauty is temporary. It teaches us to be present because the present is all we ever have. Samhain is the night when we remember what we've spent the rest of the year trying to forget. That we are mortal, that we are small, that the darkness will eventually claim us all. But it is also the night when we declare that we are still here, still breathing, still alive, still capable of love and creativity and meaning-making in a universe that offers us no guarantees. And that, paradoxically, is where the meaning comes from. Not from eternal life, but from the fact of death. Not from cosmic significance, but from the brief and precious nature of existence. The sun is rising now, slowly, inevitably, the way it always has. The darkness that seemed so absolute only hours ago begins to thin. First light touches the hills where bonfires burned, revealing the charred circles, the scattered ash, the evidence of ritual. Smoke rises pale into a sky transitioning from black to gray to the faintest wash of gold. The veil thickens. The door between worlds swings closed. The dead return to their resting places. The sea withdraw into their hollow hills. So light your candles, carve your pumpkins, tell your ghost stories, honor the dead, feed the ancestors. Leave the door unbarred for those who return, however briefly, to remind us that love does not end when the heart stops beating. That memory is a form of resurrection. We light a fire, we tell a story, we remember the dead, we refuse to let the darkness have the final word. The year has died. The year is born. And we stand between them, small before the dark, yet radiant in defiance. Once again, the world holds its breath. Between the dying flame and the newborn dawn, we stand as our ancestors did, kindling light against the encroaching shadow, speaking names that must not be forgotten, keeping vigil through the long night because that is what humans do. We bear witness, we make meaning, we refuse to go gentle. And somewhere beyond the veil, somewhere in the hollow hills, where time moves differently, and the old ones keep their own counsel, somewhere in the realm of the dead who are not gone but transformed, something ancient watches, something that has watched every Samhain since the first humans lit the first fire and wondered what lay beyond the circle of light, something that remembers every prayer, every offering, every candle lit in defiance of the dark. Something that knows we will return year after year to this threshold, this hinge, this crack in the door between worlds. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the last moment before the veil closes, before ordinary time reasserts its dominance, before the world returns to its usual solidity, it smiles.